Thank you, everyone, for jumping on here. I have a deck that I'm going to share and kind of talk through. So, with your permission, I'm just going to go ahead and start screen sharing mode, and then we'll dive in. Okay, can everybody see the screen?
Video is good.
Okay. So again, I want to thank you for having me. When I was a baby Zen student at the Santa Monica Zen Center, I heard great stories, wonderful stories, big stories about the work of Zen peacemakers. And so it's a little surreal for me to have received an invitation to share my work and my life with you. And for that, I'm deeply grateful. And I see some familiar faces and some old friends. And so hello to you all. Thanks for being here. So a little bit about me, for those of you who I'm getting to know for the first time, I'm truly obsessed with farmers and tractors. Yes, Whitney Houston, the singer and songwriter and artist, threw a water bottle at me. There's a really funny story about that, about a water bottle that came flying at about 100 miles per hour during a sound check in San Francisco. I'm totally obsessed with chocolate chip cookies. It's a problem, and I'm a Black Zen Buddhist priest. So when I was training at the Santa Monica Zen Center with the Ocean Roshi, he shared that he felt that my ability to function and powerfully and fulfill in my vows would in many ways come down and center on me being Black. Little did I know that I would be where I am today, working on a project called 1 Million Truths. So I think it's interesting that he had that foresight. Just to be really honest and transparent, I am not an expert on race or African American history. All I have is my experience, my vows, and my curiosity to share with you. And I can say that I live with a nagging feeling that there's something that all of us are missing about race and racism in the US and throughout the world. And that there's more to it than what often gets presented, highlighted, discussed, and even acted upon. And so as we spend time together, I don't want you to think or regard this as a presentation. Rather, it's me, or a lecture, rather it's me sharing what's going on in my head and what's going on in my journey at the moment. Okay. So I kind of start at the beginning. I'd like to invite each of you to sit with this question throughout our time together. So the question is how has racism affected you and your life? And so if you're aware of the cost immediately, that's great, high five. If you're not, I just invite you into the inquiry and just keep sitting with that question and returning to it throughout our time together. So to kind of, again, start at the beginning, when I was in my mother's womb, racism was already shaping my life. So I was adopted. I was given up for adoption at birth. And at birth, my name was John Ibergen, which is Dutch. My birth mother's name was Barbara Ibergen, and she is a second generation Italian American. And to my knowledge, she's still alive to this day, living in the South Bronx or somewhere on the East Coast. I've unfortunately have not had a chance to meet her, but I have had access to information about her and the circumstances that led to my adoption. So the story goes that she met my birth father in 1968 at the Catholic Church, and they fell in love, and soon thereafter she got pregnant. She hid her pregnancy, however, and never saw a doctor because her parents were racist. They would not have approved of, embraced, or accepted the fact that she had fallen in love with a Black man and was carrying a Black child, or at least a biracial child. So she kept the pregnancy secret and hidden, and then moved away one month before giving birth to me. As I read in the report that I received from the adoption agency from which I was adopted, it sounds like she went through a pretty tumultuous time. Spent 2 days with me in the hospital. When she was ready to go home, had a very hard time separating, so much so that she came back a couple of days later, and it took 4 social workers to help her actually say her final goodbye. So there's an example of how racism played out from the very beginning, at the moment of my conception even. But fortunately, I was adopted 4 months later by Claire and Myron Eckhardt, who are white. And so I have a brother and sister who are white as well. And I was adopted out of my parents' stand to ensure every child had a home. At that point in 1969, brown kids like me, Black kids like me, were already deemed hard to place. So society had already assumed and made the decision that it would be hard for me to end up in a loving home and with a good family. But thank God for my parents, Myron and Claire Eckhardt. So my life is truly a reflection of the good, the bad side of race from the very beginning. So I want to share a little bit about the origins of 1 Million Truths. They really trace back to 3 points. The first was 2016 when Trump got elected. Soon thereafter, I found myself in Los Angeles, in Encino to be specific, which is a really nice middle-class neighborhood, getting chased and getting harassed in my neighborhood. People all of a sudden were driving by me, rolling down their window and saying, "Hey, Negro, you don't belong here. Get out of this neighborhood." I've been chased, been threatened physically, and on multiple occasions, at least 6. I stopped counting at a certain point. I have been pulled, sitting in my car, pulled over to the curb on the phone, taking a business call and writing notes, only to have the police roll up behind me or the private security personnel in the neighborhood check in and see why I was there. And on every occasion, I was no farther than 3 blocks away from my home. So that really got my attention, and it was very clear that something had been kind of unlocked and unleashed in America, at least at that point. And so I reached out to my friends who were Black and just checked in, because I wanted to make sure and just kind of see, am I crazy? Am I making things up? Are these just kind of random incidents that don't mean anything? And lo and behold, all of my Black friends who I reached out to at that point were having similar experiences, from harassment from police to people in their community and neighborhoods, all the way up to crosses being burned on front lawns. So this is, I would say 2017 through 2017, 18 and 19. And even when I was back in LA, even prior to leaving to Denmark, I had an incident. It was just ridiculous. The second thing that really serves as the foundation for 1 Million Truths is a Facebook post that I wrote on Martin Luther King's holiday. I woke up that morning and I, for whatever reason, felt compelled to put pen to paper. And what came out was a post that went semi-viral that had two parts to it. The first part was just an acknowledgement and thank you and appreciation for the leaders of the civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s, and thanking them for paving the way for me to live the life I live and do the work that I'm doing in the world at the level that I'm doing it, making an impact every day as a result. The other part of the post was just my account of racism and my experiences with it from the first encounter all the way to present day. But the important thing about that post, the thing that really caught my attention, was the reaction to the folks in my life who are not Black. And so people that I grew up with in my hometown and people that I've been working with for decades, it was their shock and awe and their gasp and their overwhelming surprise that really kind of knocked me off of my feet, knocked me off center. I found myself kind of immersed in this question: how is it that people that I've known for years and decades and who know me so well, supposedly, and love me, are unaware of what my experience as an African-American male in this country has been like? And so that led me to conclude that we had a much bigger problem than I was even aware of, had even fathomed when it comes to race, racial bias, and racism in America. And then so fast forward from Martin Luther King's holiday this year to the succession of unfortunate murders that culminated in what happened to Mr. Floyd. We're in the middle of civil protest, and it was day 2 of the protest. They literally woke up in the middle of the night with 1 million truths, just full in my mind, just right there. And it was at that point that I made a commitment to follow that and to use 1 Million Truths as the inspiration to create something that would bring people together and raise awareness and deepen understanding about the issue and the dynamic in our country. I have to say, since making that commitment, there have been a lot of tears and there's been intense pain. Doing this work has forced me to search inside and go inside myself and to deal with traumas and things that I wasn't even aware of that were alive and well in my existence and my body. And it has been really intense holding the space for so many African Americans and people who are not Black, for that matter, to share their experiences and to come into contact with the dynamic that has affected basically all of us at this point. Now, there's also been a lot of joy and laughter and love and caring, and I can honestly say that I've never felt more connected to other human beings than at this point in my life as a result of this work. So it's incredibly rich, but it's multifaceted. It's a 360 experience. A little more on 1 Million Truths. So other inspirations and other things that informed what we've created and are creating is the experience that so many Black people share of not being heard, believed are being invalidated. And I've also personally felt very frustrated by the narrow range of expression that makes the headlines and is featured in the media. The truth is we're human beings and we have a full range of expression that we use to share and convey what's going on for us. But so much of what we see and what we're presented in the media, in the headlines, is so narrow. And so I wanted to create something that would allow Black Americans to express themselves fully. And so we've created a platform to convey the scale of racism in America. We think it's really important to show how it plays out in the nooks and crannies and corners in our country. We see the big stuff that makes the media and the news every night, but we don't necessarily see what's happening in the corners and the cracks in the small towns on a day-to-day basis. And the other intention is to build an archive that will live on forever. The hope is that future generations will look back on what we've captured and go, oh my gosh, what was that? Thank goodness we're not dealing with that. That's completely foreign. So it's all built or predicated on individual stories from Black Americans throughout the country, from all walks of life, from famous to not famous, men and women from tiny towns that you've never heard of, and much more. And it's a way for people to respond to the truths and the things that the Black community shares. It's an invitation for people to reconstitute their relationship with us. And it's intended to create the space for us to take action, ideally different or hopefully different types of actions to resolve this problem and challenge in our life. So to give you a sense of the truths that we're aggregating and inviting people to create and share and post on the platform, I'm going to share mine. And so just give me a couple thumbs up to make sure that you hear the audio once it kicks in and goes. Here it comes. Can you hear it?
The first time I was called a nigger, I was 8 years old. I happened to be on a soccer field and retrieving a ball that had kind of gone off. I was retrieving it for a little girl who was on the pitch. I wasn't even doing anything. I wasn't even messing with her. I just ran to help get the ball and help her out. And she called me a nigger just for that. I can't even count the number of experiences of being out with my childhood white friends only to hear them say, oh, look at those niggers over there, as if I was invisible, as if I wasn't even there. I could talk about the fear and the desperation I felt when I was accused of abducting a young lady. I could tell you about the horror of being ambushed by a group of Nazis while attending a party as a teenager. I could share in vivid detail the experience of being in a business meeting with my business partner and having them make off-color jokes and the pain that I felt. It's not about one experience. It is about the constant, consistent experience of having to deal with racism and having to constantly weave in and out of it and around it because it's everywhere and it's exhausting. It's absolutely exhausting. The world is changing in a way where we're going to be dealing with climate-related events. We have economic disparity to deal with, including social justice. But we don't have any more time for this nonsense. The way we're living, the way we're relating to each other, how we're treating each other is not sustainable. And so we need to do this work now so we are prepared for what's coming at us. Together, we can absolutely create a better future.
So the latter part of my truth is something that I'll touch on a little farther into our time together here. So obviously there's been a succession, pretty consistent, steady succession of experiences that have come my way and that I've had to deal with and have been absorbed into who I am and my perspective on life. But we all know that my situation isn't unique. But what's so interesting, after talking to hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of Black Americans over the last, I call it 4 months, is that the first encounter with racism typically happens between the years of 7 and 15 years old. There's been a few exceptions to that, and those people have shared that their first encounter happened at the ages of 2 and 3 and 4 and 5. So I want you to just think about the implications of that. Just the simple practical implications of that. So what happens is that activates the experience of being another. So in a Buddhist context, separation, small mind starts to take form. The reality is at that age, we're all too young to have the skills to process what we've just experienced. And because of the inability to process or the ability to ask for help, to understand what has actually taken place and to send it and head it in a better direction, a healthy direction in terms of response, the identity begins to form around the experience and reinforce it through repeated experiences. So regardless of where you end up as a Black American, your filter for life is that of Blackness. And what's so interesting is that I've had the good fortune of talking with many African Americans and other people of color who have lived in other countries where the dynamics are not the same. And they don't have that. And Grant knows Michael Marshall, who's part of the team who's helping to make all this happen and to make it sure that it's a success. Michael spent over 20 years in Japan. And he has a really powerful story about re-entering the United States and being reminded that he was Black. And he, little by little, has felt this mechanism get reactivated. And so he's in the soup, as are the rest of us. So I'm going to share another truth. This is Gina Belafonte. She's the daughter of Harry Belafonte, who was one of the leaders in the civil rights movement back in the day. Here she comes.
I was 7 years old when my father's best friend was murdered. The person who murdered them was a racist. It was the first time I saw my father ever cry. For years, I never really thought about the trauma surrounding that. I always looked to humor to mask feelings.
The situation that Gina is sharing with us, the moment that she's there with her family, with her father in particular, was the moment that they found out about the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King. So her father was best friends with Dr. King. And so you hear the effect of that experience and how she reacted to it, how she compensated with it, with humor in response to it. So again, that experience for her happened at 7 years old, and it's affected and shaped the rest of her life, in spite of being a very, very, very committed student to her own development and understanding in practice and so on and so forth. And so what we have here, and this is not new information, is we have generations of people in our country who are suffering deeply and have been from a very, very young age. And just imagine the percentage of population that is not working at their best and not operating at their highest potential and possibility. It's quite tragic, but it is on the flip side, there's huge opportunity in that to do some healing, to get some work done, to unlock some of the potential that we're not getting from them. So they can have a better life and find themselves more fulfilled and expressed in the world, and we can participate and create and collaborate with them in bringing new things and ideas to the world that are desperately needed. So all of that has just made me want to know why and push beyond the typical assertions and assumptions in hopes of finding a way to alleviate some of the suffering around this dynamic. And that brings me to the 3 poisons. So for those of you who are well immersed in the Buddhist world, there's greed, anger, and ignorance. And I'm just going to touch on a few things here that kind of points to these, because I think that they really can serve as a very, very good frame for getting our heads around what's in motion. So we'll start with greed, and I'm going to play another video. This is from Michael Marshall. He's the gentleman I referred to a couple of minutes ago, and he has spent his entire career in the financial industry at the highest level, running divisions for big, 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 big firms, working for very, very, very wealthy individuals. And so this is what he's shared with us.
Wall Street has afforded me a lifestyle, but it's also afforded me the opportunity to look behind the curtain. People are very clever with money. People have built systems that reinforce one another. Media that tells stories of European perfection that absolutely doesn't exist. But the layperson on the street, they believe that Europe is the Valhalla. Capitalism works if there is balance, a system that invites everyone to participate equally. We don't have that. We have a financial aristocracy, full stop. Part of what holds the structure in place is a caste system. Of course, it's this patriarchal system. At the bottom of that, and you have to have somebody at the bottom for everybody to have their station. The bottom of that are African Americans.
So we all know that capitalism needs rethinking. I mean, that's abundantly clear. We also know that business and economic growth took hold in the US based on free labor made possible through slavery. So it makes sense that Black Americans would end up at the bottom of the class structure. And it also explains why immigrants from Asia and other parts of the world don't report the same experience. They tend to make more money and they tend to hold more wealth than Blacks. So one of the key takeaways from hours of conversation, immersive conversation with Michael, is the notion that race is used as a lever to keep the class system in place. And so seeing it through this lens opens up new possibilities and conversations to have about what we can do to start to unlock that grip. So I'm going to move on to anger here. And I've got another video that was created and shared by a wonderful woman by the name of Nia Hill. She's an activist. She's a member of the LGBTQ community. She's an artist, she's a creative, and she's just a powerhouse. Here's her experience with anger.
My name is Nia Hill. I'm from Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. Was raised in a suburb of Oklahoma City, actually, all-white suburb. I am a Kappa Alpha Theta from the University of Oklahoma, as well as a Zeta Phi Beta. So the question becomes, how did I become a member of two sororities? Well, the answer is simple. I didn't know that the systems were separate. And my freshman year coming in, I rushed with all white girls. And I didn't know that it had never happened before. So it became really an inciting theme for the racism that had already existed on the campus before my arrival. I just was the spark. So it was incumbent upon the administration at the university for them to provide protection for me during the 13-day process of rush. And they did that by putting me in an entire building by myself for the 13 days and all the other girls in another building. There wasn't a day or a night that went by that I didn't get death threats under my door, shots through my dorm room. It was, some people call me insane for doing it or just plain stupid. I just knew that there was something wrong. And if I could make it right in any way, I was going to do it, no matter what it cost me. Did it cost me? Yes. It wouldn't come to cost me in the ways that it has until many years later. So I'm still paying that price. But what it also did was create a certain kind of character that hopefully becomes a part of my legacy or a doorway for other brown girls who look like me, who they said, no, you don't belong here too. I'm just here to say, yes, you do.
So again, another powerful truth. And while the specifics for Nia's truth are unique, the anger and the hate is not. Everyone, every Black American that I've spoken to in the context of 1 Million Truths has a story like Nia's where they've been threatened with violence or death. And so, I've really kind of leaned into, just the anger towards us. And it really seems down to a fierce rejection of human equity, that we all are the same, different and unique, but the same at the same time. So I'm going to keep going here, touch on ignorance. Now, when I set out, you know, I really thought I knew racism. I mean, I'd lived with it, I've seen it playing out, read about it, studied it, et cetera, et cetera. I really thought that I had a grasp on it from the inside out, and top to bottom, et cetera. But I learned very quickly that I don't. And I'm very, very ignorant about a lot of what makes bias and racism. And so that brings me to not knowing is most intimate. And this is where I have found incredible refuge as we continue walking and pursuing and building and moving 1 million truths forward. And it's actually where I prefer to sit, and I'm choosing to sit in spite of so many demands and so many people insisting that it become a very specific thing. So many people have very clear opinions about what racism is and what racism isn't, and how it can be solved and resolved and eliminated and eradicated. And I think a lot of that is a trap. I think a lot of that is a trap. So there are many lenses. And so what I intend to do here in this section is just to illuminate the many lenses through which you can view racism and bias. In doing so, just to underscore this notion of not knowing is most intimate. And hopefully we can create a little space we can let go of the grasp that we have on our point of view and our position on it. And so I'm going to go through these really quickly. So you can perceive racism and bias through the lens of private or individual acts or racism, or institutional. You can look at it from the perspective of foreign players. So we do know that countries like Russia, China, Iran, and even parts of the Muslim community are leveraging the tension and the dynamic of racism in the United States to try to destabilize. There's a ton of research and there's a ton of agencies that have facts to that matter. You can look at it from the point of view of national players, from the perspective of white supremacists, fringe groups, and even the Black Lives Matter movement. So a number of different vantage points to look at this dynamic in the country. It's incredibly complex. And then there's class warfare. We touched on that. Michael in this video shared about that. And so what we do know is that the upper class has more experience with strategy, and they're able to keep the middle and lower classes focused on the strife between them or us as a way of distracting from what's actually playing out in the dynamics that have led to 1% continuing to increase wealth, while we're seeing the middle class in America decline, and overall wealth held by Americans decline, and so on and so forth. So that's another lens through which we can look at this dynamic. We can also look at it from a global context, from one side of the spectrum being genocide all the way to equity, or kind of like the ideal notion for a state or a society or culture or community. So the question is where do we fall in the spectrum of racism here? Certainly there are people who are being murdered and have been murdered and physically harmed in very severe, extreme ways. But that is not the majority of what's taking place in this country. And then we can also look at, what's going on in China, for example. And so this is me touching on the fact that racism and bias is not just a black and white phenomenon that's beholden to the United States. In China, China's doing a heck of a lot to basically stamp out the Muslim community there. Another Africa, 350 Nigerian Christians were massacred in the first 2 months of 2020. Over 11,500 Christians have been murdered since June 2015, and 4 to 5 million Christians have been displaced. So while there are fringe groups here in the United States who thinks blacks should be killed or removed from the country, the large majority of racism centers around not wanting to spend time together or be in relationship with each other. I'm going to keep going here. So when it comes to law enforcement, this is a really controversial issue here, but it's another lens through which we can see this dynamic playing out. The fact is that the statistics that have been afforded us or provided us by way of the Black Lives Movement doesn't comport with the actual data. It's hard to pull together because there isn't one central agency tracking this, but there's some people that have done a very, very good job of kind of pulling the data from many different sources and interpreting them as accurately as possible. So the truth is that most killings in the US by cops are justified, in the context of the law. Some are unjustified, of course, and some are hard to tell. We're mostly focused as it pertains to Black folks on the unjustified killings that come by way of the hands of cops. And so there's about 1,000 each year. 25% of those are Black, 50% are white. So the truth is that white people in America are more likely to be shot by cops unjustly than Black people are. Now, it's also true that Black cops are more likely to go hands-on with African Americans than they are whites or other groups of people. And there's many reasons to potentially explain that. For example, bias on the part of the police officers, rage on the part of cops, wanting to just cause harm and do violence, resistance to complying to orders, lack of trust in police, suspicion, all kinds of stuff. This is a hotbed issue. But my point is that often what's communicated out in media is not consistent with what's actually playing out in real time. And so it makes it harder and harder to figure out how we're going to solve this stuff, how we're going to reduce conflict and tension, how we're going to move forward as a community, as a country, and as a society. And I should say one thing, I forgot to say something. The facts show that, or point in the direction that Black cops and Hispanic cops are more likely to take violent action against Blacks and Hispanics. And that was a hard thing for me to get my head around or want to swallow when it was offered to me by a researcher. So again, we have a lot to think about here when it comes to this dynamic. And here's some more facts really quickly. So Blacks in the US, 13% of the population commit 50% of the murders, commit 66% of all crime. Blacks are 6 times more likely to be murdered than whites. 90% of those killings are committed by Blacks and 95% are Black on Black crime. So there's a huge dynamic in our community that we need to address. And there's a lot of pushback back and forth about how to address this and whether or not we should address it and who's to blame and who's the source of it. But from a 1 millionth truth perspective, to bring something forth that has as much integrity as we can possibly muster, we have to include these facts and this data in the conversation. So I've spoken to so many people who've just kind of wondered about, like, where's the transition point here? And so in the Black community, there are those who argue that, along the likes of Thomas Lowry, for example, that the responsibility to kind of move forward and create a better society and create more stability and certainty for the Black community falls on us, on our shoulders. And there are those in the Black community who insist that those who are in power have the mandate to act. And then there are those in the white community and other communities who point the finger at Blacks. My point is, again, is that racism is extremely complex. And right now, it seems like more than ever, in some ways, the power dynamic is rooted in clashing with one another. So conflict of theory. So given the complexity of racism, how do we solve it? And here I turn to Rene Girard. So I'm going to start with a quote. "Man is the creature who does not know what to desire, and he turns to others in order to make up his mind. We desire what others desire because we imitate their desires." And so Rene Girard is a French historian, literary critic, and philosopher of social science whose works belongs to the tradition of anthropological philosophy. He's recognized worldwide for his theory on human behavior, human culture, and conflict. And so here it is. And the reason why I'm sharing this with you, because I'm really committed to unpacking this dynamic to the degree that I'm capable of, and we are capable of. And what was missing for me in the group, for the most part, was a model of frameworks through which we could see this dynamic playing out and perhaps have an explanation for it that would unlock more conversation, perspective, and possibilities. So in this model, Girard asserts that conflict can express as race or racism, or it can express as religious tension. It could express as gender disparity. It can be expressed as nationalism, or anything that you want or can point at. But that may not necessarily be the origin, according to Girard. Its origin is the mimesis of desire, or imitation, or the way we imitate people that we've deemed to have something that we've deemed valuable. So we learn language by watching people speak and copying them. We learn our value systems through copying. We learn body posturing through copying. So that explains why Tutsi, for example, isn't going to want a BMW or necessarily a vehicle that I want. It's because their value system reflects what they have imitated and what they've observed in their culture. Very obvious and straightforward here. So the fundamental idea again is that we want what other people have, and we learn to want what other people have and acquire through modeling and imitation. And that leads to conflict, because in short, they have what we want. And so conflict is based, from Girard's perspective, on a desire for scarce stuff. As more people want the same thing, conflict energy grows. So for example, there is a massive conflict going on between India and China right now. It's being expressed as racial tension or along racial lines. But as you peel back the layers, you find that where the conflict is at its source has to do with water rights. So that's an example. And so conflict itself becomes mimetic, and people start to become a nationalist or an anti-nationalist simply by copying. The tension builds until there's so much conflict energy in the system that it turns to violence. Girard said that the best way to deal with conflicts is scapegoating. So whenever there's tension or conflict that's building up in the system, there is a way in which people historically have relieved or lowered the tension, and that's through scapegoating. And if you look way back through religious practice and in early religions, sacrifice was the first form of scapegoating. So the question here for us is, how are we using scapegoating? Who is being used for it? How is it being used? Who is suffering the cost of scapegoating in order to relieve the tension around racism and ethnic bias in order to prevent it from going over the edge? So I just believe that Girard's conflict model gives another way or another view into racism. And the persistent tension is a function of copying and imitating the way in which people pursue what they want. And so the problem is once your identity has been formed around a certain way of being, it's all rooted in what you want, and you've copied, you've in a sense mastered that. And you must ensure intention. So for example, if I'm adamant as a Black man that white people are inherently racist, then I have to perpetuate that. My identity is formed around that. I have to make sure that that reality exists. So I'm going to go around looking for evidence in many ways to confirm my reality. Now, I want to make a clear distinction here. Things are absolutely happening. There are facts that are rooted in this dynamic playing out, but there's also a huge part of what is playing out that is just rooted in how we are wired as human beings to make meaning out of our experiences. And as you know, as Buddhist practitioners, the practice that we engage in, sitting, the practice of Zazen is a huge doorway or portal to unlocking that and disrupting the grip that that has over us. So I'm going to keep going here. So given its complexity, how do you solve for racism? And I'm going to skip the next video here, and I'm just going to share a story. I'm going to go right to our theory of change. So about a month after creating my video, I shared it with an ex-girlfriend of mine. She was white, blonde hair, blue-eyed, and of German descent. And she sent me a text back. She's just like, "That's really powerful, Mark. Wow, like, good job." She congratulated me. And then about a month later, I got a call from her, and it resulted in a 3-hour conversation. And she shared about the conversations that are taking place with her husband, with her family, with her community, and even at the workplace. And there's a lot of fear. She's at a point where she's afraid to drive an hour into Los Angeles because she's been told that she's going to be killed by Black people, and so on and so forth. She's completely torn and confused about what the best vote for her would be in the upcoming election, and so on and so forth. Then she got to our relationship, and she went on and on about our relationship. And the thing about it was we dated for maybe 6 months, and then we just kind of fizzled. I went my way. I was in college at the time. I thought she was going her way. Just thought that, bad timing, paths just went different directions. But it turned out that she was deeply in love with me, and she had already envisioned a life with me, with kids and a family. But she gave that up because of the bias and the racism of her father and her extended family members. And she admitted, and during that call, that she had not had the courage to stand up to them. She didn't have the sense of self-power. She didn't have the sense of self-integrity to really stand for what she believed was right for her. And then she went as far as to take responsibility for the succession of failed marriages that have ended because of toxicity and abuse, physical and other. And then she connected that succession of relationships that have just not gone well to the fact that she did not stand for who she loved at a time that was most critical. And when I heard that conversation, when I heard her share that, it was a really powerful moment that kind of comported with many other conversations that I've had. And so I'm just kind of going to get into it a little bit here. So what we've learned is calling someone a racist creates a bind. They can either agree or disagree. Most of the time they disagree, and then you get into an argument about it. Accusing someone of being complicit turns moderates into opposition. So it's just a dumb move to point at somebody who's not demonstrating in visible ways that they're taking anti-racist action. It's a dumb move to call them complicit. We've seen over and over and over again how that turns people into the opposition. People who are resistant to helping, people who are no longer willing or open to the possibility of getting involved and helping. Okay. So I want to just offer this question to you, this inquiry. What if racism is a phenomenon that has all of us in its grasp? What if we gave up pointing the finger at people and accusing them of complicity in being racist? What if it was literally something, a phenomena that has all of us in its grasp? And yes, there's people that have exploited it to their advantage, and there's been harm caused as a result of that over many, many years. But what if it is a phenomena that has all of us in our grasp? What would that open up? What kind of space would that grant us to look from different vantage points and have different conversation and to think in different ways? And what if privilege is a form of delusion that prevents people from connecting the cost of racism to themselves and in their lives? And this is the thing that really opened up the aperture with my ex-girlfriend, Erica. And we were able to kind of get over all of the things in her life that were preventing her from really seeing what was going on in her life. And it didn't require me saying, you're a contributor to racism, you're contributing to my suffering. It was her own experience that she had an opportunity to step in and take responsibility for and possibly change. And so when it comes to failure being, I think that this really applies here. When we fail to take action in the face of racism, we incur cost to ourselves at the level of being. Of course, there's a spectrum of costs that span material things, but I'm more interested in the non-material costs that we incur constantly. But what we do in a sense is train ourselves or the mind to incur those costs and to live with them and justify them. So I'm going to end here for the most part with the question that I began with. How has racism affected you and your life in the form of self-expression, personal power, creativity, energy, health, well-being, connection, relationships, and love? Where has it played out in your work, in your communities, and even your families? But what's the impact of that? I really believe that if we can help people get connected to the impact of this dynamic playing out in their lives, that we'll actually see more action than that we're currently seeing. And so, let's see what else here. I'm just going to finish with why action is really, really critical. Of course, there's the obvious dynamics. We want to reduce suffering in the world. We want to make sure people have an opportunity to pursue and create the life that they want to create and live for themselves. But as I alluded to in my truth, I think there's much larger dynamics that in many ways, how do I want to put this? I think in many ways we've outgrown racism. I think we are about to experience the real effects of climate change and other dynamics that have been set in motion, some man-made, some others. And as a result of that, we've outgrown racism in the way that we are relating to it, viewing it, describing it, and taking action. I think we either solve it now or we're going to suffer immensely. And I don't mean to be a doomsdayer here, but I'm well aware, as I'm sure many of you are, of what is truly coming our way in the disruption to our lives, to our economies, to where people are able to live and not live, the massive migration that is coming our way, and so on and so forth, the destruction to the biosphere and the effects of that. And so when I look at those dynamics playing out, and I put racism next to those, I just say we don't have any more time. It's time for everyone to get in touch with the costs of the dynamics of racism playing out and to make a choice. It really comes down to that. And it doesn't have to be, I want to support Black people and I want Black people to have everything that I have. It really comes down to an existential question, in my point of view. How do we want to live on this world, and what is the condition of world that we want to live in, and how are we going to respond to these dynamics playing out as they affect us more and more and at an accelerated rate? So I wish I had trumpets and horns and fanfare to end on, but I think that we have to wake up to these realities. And I think we can get through racism by focusing our energies on efforts on something that I think is a lot more massive. And that's not me underscoring or underplaying or devaluing what I go through every day in this country. But I think it's a necessary point of view to take on and consider if we're going to move forward. So I'm going to end on that. And Jeff, I believe we have some time left over. We can have conversation. I'm happy to take questions or anything like that.
Thank you, Mark. We do have time. We've scheduled till the bottom of the hour, so we can use that or not as interest dictates. And so we'd like to open this up for questions. And I can see everybody, so we don't need to be too technological here. If you prefer to raise your electronic hand, that's always fun. But I can also see you if you do this too, and I'll just call your name and you can unmute yourself. And I know that I'm very stimulated. I could ask questions for the next hour, but I won't do that. I'll leave it to you all. So please, anyone with a question? Sandra, was that your hand? Go ahead and unmute if you'd like. Yeah.
Okay, it was a great pleasure for me to hear your speech, because I live in Brazil. I'm from the northeast of Brazil, and here for me it's something that always worried me, because here in Brazil, different from the United States, most of half of the population is Black, and during my 2-decade practice around sanghas in different places of Brazil, it's a two white sangha, and for me it's very difficult to understand and accept that. And in the last 2 weeks, we had a very how can I say, hard question to answer, a problem that has a national repercussion about women that has mental problems and was very racist in a bank, and say, "I hate niggers," and the speech of her was in this way, and for my terror, that was a person that sometimes is used to practice in a sangha, and for me it's the problem of the racism is very urgent, like you said, and you exposed. But sometimes it's very difficult to talk in the Sangha about these questions. I'm talking about my Brazilian Sangha, because sometimes we have a vision that, oh, it's a problem of identity. We have to solve like a Zoltan view and some kind of questions, and this problem of racism is like a taboo sometimes to talk in the Sangha. What you could recommend to us to bring these questions and these necessary talks in the Sangha in a more effective way?
I'll take a pass at that, but I certainly would love to open it up to the entire group to share their thoughts and reflections on it. And Gyoku, hello. It's been many years since we've seen each other. It's good to see you. Um, uh, I think part of the answer is inviting people to get connected to the cost of that dynamic playing out in their lives and even within the Sangha. Um, I think it's also a conversation about, what is the future of the Sangha and what do we want it to be and who do we want it to include and how can we go about that? But I strongly discourage you from going in the direction, or anyone within the Sangha going in the direction and trying to assert that somebody is racist or the Sangha is racist. It's more complex than that. And just taking the nervous system, the brain into consideration, as soon as we go limbic, it becomes exponentially more difficult to make progress. I don't know, Yoko, do you have any recommendations for what Sandro might do with his Sangha?
Mark, thank you so much. I'm so moved by it. And depending on the composition of your Sangha already, if you have a BIPOC Sangha, I really recommend a BIPOC group within a Sangha is useful. And so people have a place to just share. I love Mark's question, how has racism affected your life from the get-go? The questions like that can really open a space for people to share deeply. So at ZCLA, we have a BIPOC Sangha and a group of white Sangha that's really deeply looking at anti-racism work. And we're all struggling with that communication and all of that, but it's done in the spirit of, let's just explore. Let's see where we are. And as Mark said, just an open invitation to look at our own experiences about these issues. And I think as practitioners, that's the beautiful thing, is we do have this sense of invitation and a way to enter a space where we can really talk from our experience. Just using the 3 tenets, for example, is an amazing framework for this kind of conversation. So yeah, it's such a rich, powerful, immediate and intimate condition for each of us to share. And it's a great practice opportunity, I would say. That sounds awful, but it is. For us to just speak from our hearts, right? About what is truly troubling us, and to be able to learn together from each other how we're all affected by it. And then see where that goes. What are the actions that come up around that? Yeah. And our Sangha has a really strong statement about addressing these issues, like forevermore. Although, as Mark points out, with the climate emergency that's going on, it may become a mute conversation.
Yeah.
Because we really will be about, let's save each other. Let's just take care of the human race in the face of this kind of calamity.
Yeah. Thank you, Yoko. Sandro, I'll add one more thing. I guess a question I would pose to your Sangha is, are you okay with there being racist amongst yourself within the Sangha? Now, I'm not saying people that are outright doing things that are not appropriate and causing more suffering in the world, but people who have identified having racist thoughts and maybe shaping their life around those perceptions. So one of the glorious things and one of the highest privileges that I have as a result of pursuing 1 Million Truths is I've had conversations with so many people who are not Black who've said, you know what, I'm a racist. I've seen it happen in small groups, I've seen it happen in large groups, and it's taken place in one-on-one conversations. And not once has that person been attacked, shamed, or tossed out. They've been embraced, they've been loved, and they've been acknowledged. And so, owning that is just owning all sides of who we are. Back to Jeff.
Sandra, just one other thought, and and this is from our personal experience here locally in my Sangha. We have a book group that meets fairly regularly, and last year we approached Ruth King's book, Mindful of Race. And Mark, I'm not sure if I'm sure you're aware of it.
Yeah.
And we shared it and considered it in 3 or 4 settings. And it really, and I'll tell you, our Sangha is 100, I think I can say this, nearly 100% white, so, you know, as you've mentioned here in Boulder, Colorado, if you can imagine. And the book was so impactful for everyone. We, as a group, a small group, have undertaken a year-long commitment to working with Ruth King's, principles of racial affinity group, and we're meeting monthly for a year, and talking about our experience, and looking deeply at who we are and what we believe and what we think and feel. It's just a thought. I'm not sure if Ruth has translated into Portuguese, or if that would be necessary, but it's a good resource.
Okay, if you could put this reference in the chat, I will be very grateful. And nowadays I'm studying in a study group of whiteness, to critical whiteness, and it's very helpful to talk about racism with white people too, here in Brazil too. And I'm very grateful to Mark and Angel and you.
Thank you, Sandro.
Please, we have a good sized group here, and we have some time, so it's an excellent opportunity to pose your question. I promise not to call on anyone. Odell, thank you for coming. It looks like you need to go. Thanks so much for being here. Good to see you again. Jonathan, was that your hand, or?
Go to Grant first.
Okay.
Mark, thank you. And it's been interesting watching 1 Million Truths unfold, and I really appreciate your presentation. It's great to see where it is now.
Thanks.
And very moving. And as a white guy who only recently really owned the privilege of whiteness and understanding, or starting to step into understanding what that means, it's work we have to do. And I think the sad thing is, coming to Egyoku's point, reflecting on your comment about the whole climate crisis too, is unfortunately, I think it unfolds more negatively, because those scarce resources you talk about will become more scarce, and the conflict will become more violent. That's not a trumpet and happy time thought, of course, but Sandro, the tool that I use when I'm speaking with white folks, if they're not already stepping in some way into owning this responsibility that we have, is, and I think this works whether it's a Buddhist group or not, is a version of Mark's question of, how is racism affecting you? So how do you feel about all of this going down? And they may be expressing their fear, and it's about how it's, that they're worried about losing this and that, and it's not fair. And I listen, and then I say, well, have you thought about what it would be like to wake up Black yourself tomorrow? Would you choose that? And I've always found that opens it up a little bit. I'm not accusing them of anything, just ask that, that sort of thought experiment. And I've had people say, well, that's not fair. And of course, that's the greatest opening, because that's my point. And for those of us who do practice in Zen and Buddhism, Zen is all of life. And to deny that opportunity to practice the Dharma, is that really what we want to do? Is that how we want to practice? So just a couple of thoughts. And Mark, again, thank you I'm glad we made it this time. I think it might have been richer being postponed by 3 weeks because 1 Million Truths got a little further along. But
so they gave me some more time to lose myself.
yeah, well, I want to say that I still haven't gotten my butter cookies.
Oh man, they're on the plane.
Okay. Thanks again.
Thanks, Grant. And my friend Jonathan, you had your hand up. I don't know if you're in Sonoma or back in Eagle Rock.
No, I'm back in smoky Los Angeles.
Okay.
Hello, Goku. Hello, Jeff. Nice to see you both. Mark, thank you. I'm Jonathan. Thank you for your presentation. It's real powerful. And Jeff has my email. If I can help out in any way, I would love to. There's so many thoughts that are crossing my mind. I came to this country when I was 7 years old, Cuban, and to me it was the language thing. I was always the immigrant. I was always the spick. And when you said that you had two names, my birth name was Felix Navarro. Felix Navarro wasn't going to go anywhere outside of Little Miami, Little Hialeah. So I looked at my father and I said, Dad, I'm changing my name. I had the privilege, as my wife says, you had the privilege of skin, where you can change your name and go somewhere else and say, and I worked as an actor. So I remember just saying, Dad, I love you, but I'm going to change my name. I'm a spick no matter where I go. And he goes, well, you can change your name, but you're still going to be my son. And he gave me that blessing, but I was able to I think almost use the 3 poisons against me, because I realized the price that I paid by changing my name and living in a different world. Because as my wife says, you're so angry. And I had friends along the way who would say, you should see somebody about that. And I've always thought, well, who would I be without that anger? And so the anger came back to me to bite me in the ass, so to speak. And the greed was my way of saying, you see, I'll show you. I'll show you. I'll be successful. So it's funny how the poisons have come to bite me in the ass, literally, because it's my delusion. And I've always thought, and every now and then my wife will say to me, I wonder, had you stayed Felix Navarro, who would you be? And ironically, now I'm in a 9-month program with Foundations for Contemplative Care. And Koshin Paley, he knows my story. And he always comes and looks at the camera and says, Felix Navarro, Felix Navarro. And I think it's funny that my teacher's the only one who calls me. Yeah, the first thing, with 70 people on Zoom. And he'll go, hello, good morning, everybody. Good morning, Felix. And he does that. And I think it's ironic that I've come full circle via Zen. And my heart just opens up because I don't know. You mirrored something in your presentation, that otherness. And I think it happens to immigrants too. And I was just, as I was seeing your presentation, I thought, what a beautiful thing. It was just lovely, and thank you for that. And by the way, that whole theory also of wanting something else. Yeah, absolutely. It's what I remember as a kid when, even though I never got to Catholic school, but Catholic school, everybody had the same uniform. So there wouldn't be that, where you're wearing Nikes and I'm wearing Adidas, it's wanting that otherness. And, but anyway, listen, thank you so much. And
thank you for sharing. That's so powerful. A couple things come up for me. Just playfully setting the practical aspects of name aside, have you ever considered officially going back to your original name?
My wife looks at me every day and says, I don't want to be Nichols. And I'm like, really? Come on. Come on. And to be honest, when I looked in the mirror, Mark, and I saw Peter O'Toole. I don't know why, but I did. So, yes, I wonder sometimes. I think about it.
That's great. I'll tell you, that would be a really powerful act.
Shit.
Very powerful act in support of addressing this dynamic. I'm going to reclaim. I'm going to resume who I was born as. Step back into that. Very powerful. And the other thing is, I was just, before jumping on the call with all of you, I was in a really meaty discussion with a few very fun, brilliant people. And we were like, well, what set up this desire dynamic within the country? And we landed on the whole notion of the American dream. The whole construct is set up for conflict and pursuits of those things that are deemed more valuable, and those things that are deemed more scarce. It's one of the reasons why very, very expensive luxury brands do so well. They're playing on the whole notion of conflict and status and class. So what if just the whole construct for this country could shift? I mean, now I'm going way out there, but thought I'd share. Who else? Please. I love this.
Thank you. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you.
Gracias, Señor Navarro. Mi amigo, mi corazón.
Yes.
Oh my God, they're not going to let me live this down.
I think it's all but done, other than on the official documentation.
Oh my God, call the attorney, Jeff.
So, Mark, I'm going to be voice for Jean-Paul, who does not have a microphone and chatted. If that's okay, I'll read what Jean-Paul has written. I don't have a camera or a mic, so chat is my only option. Mark, do you know of or have you met Claiborne Carson, who was asked by Coretta Scott King to weave all of the MLK documents? He authored the autobiography of MLK. He's at, I think it says Sanford, or I don't know if it's Sanford or Stanford. Very accessible. It will save you reinventing. Also, in your interviewing, do you have a memory of MLK and nonviolence? Let's see. I'm currently studying with Carson. At 74, I've lived memory microcosm that I am now weaving with the macrocosm of the same seasons. Let's see, what else can I pull here? And then, is it different to use the verb othering rather than the noun racism? So maybe I'll leave it at that. Mark, you can see those as well, and perhaps I think there's a few questions in there. So as you prefer, perhaps pull one or all, or.
Sure. I'll cover two really quickly. So I know of Claiborne. I've never had the chance of meeting him. Would be honored to do so. There's a way to make that connection. I'm all for it. Let me know what I can do to support it and happening. And to the question about othering as a verb rather than the noun racism, I don't have an answer to that right now, but it's a great question, and I will sit with it and see where it leads me. And I'd be happy to share where I land on that. And thank you, Jean-Paul. You're on mute, Jeff. It looks like you're saying some good stuff.
There we go. Thanks, Mark, and thank you, Jean-Paul. We have time for more questions here. If there's Ula, thank you.
So Zen Peacemakers is, primarily, but the people I see in the councils I go to is primarily a white organization with really wonderful, I do not consider, just because it's a white organization, that it's a racist organization. And yet I have kind of advocated for the need for these questions that you raise to be discussed in councils within Zen Peacemakers, and I brought it up to with, like, I go to the women's group, and I brought it up there that, you know, that this was it was interesting that we, you know, why were we so white? You know, what has happened that we are so white? And the response I got was, you know, just, you know, that they're very accepting, listening. And then at the end, someone said, well, you know, if anybody has any, you know, friends who are people of color, you know, invite them. And I thought, ooh, that's kind of off the mark to me. And I felt kind of, again, that I don't want to be, I feel like I'm kind of this broken wicket that kind of, you know, periodically says my little spiel, like, I really think we ought to be addressing these things more in councils. And it's you know, it's going to tend to be, you know, people of one racial grouping, Caucasian primarily, addressing these issues among themselves. You know, but I still feel, after listening to you, and, you know, and I appreciated your very serious efforts to widen the question of racism and to look at it from a variety of lenses, to really encourage people to, you know, think about it differently and not just in very set, concrete ways. But I guess, again, I want to kind of encourage ourselves here as active members of Zen Peacemakers to sit down with each other in, you know, in a series of councils, or however we want to arrange it, to begin to just, you know, really sit with these questions. I feel a need for that myself. I'd like to do it with people that I, you know, that I've grown to trust. You know, because these are difficult and painful things to explore, sort of no matter what your racial identity is, you know. So that's, I just felt I had to say this again. That's all I got to say.
Thank you. And I believe I'm sensing and seeing and feeling the emotion that's behind what you've just shared and the experience that you're having. And it's very powerful. I encounter or receive this question a lot. Being a Black dude, spent a lot of time within Sanghas. I've been asked point blank, you know, does Buddhism have a racism problem and things like that? I just can't encourage you enough to, you know, keep finding ways to help people reflect on what's so for them. And I'll never forget one time Yoshin Roshi, he leaned over to me and his blue eyes and little wink, and he said, you know, Mark, you're only going to be as big as you're willing to be small. It's just like, you have to tell one on yourself constantly if you expect other people to step into that space with you. And so one of the most powerful experiences I had soon after completing my vows as a priest was around the work we were doing to end hunger and lead the starvation. And Roshi had requested that I lead a few events and activities. And so my job was to, you know, inspire a bunch of people to get involved and help us raise money to end hunger on the planet. And so I wrote an email, and it began with, I simply do not care. I do not care if people starve. You know, I do not wake up in the morning and that's the first thing that I'm present to. And the reaction I got to that was huge. And so what I'm pointing at is I think we need to give ourselves even more position just to be who we are and to own our humanity. And so where people are reluctant to share their thoughts about why the Sangha doesn't have more diversity in it, there's just more space that needs to be created. They need to be assured of safety. They need to be confident that there won't be consequences, that they won't be shunned or cast out. So you have to continue nurturing the conditions and creating a safe space for people to basically get away with saying anything responsibly, of course, and go from there. And so it just sounds like there's some more work that's needed to be done around the conditions that would give rise to the conversation that you want to have. And so I would be, engaging Jeff in that conversation and others who are part of leadership to see how you can continually ripen the conditions for people to own all of themselves without fear of consequence. And Yoko, I'll kick it back to you, given your deep experience with Sangha.
The short interviews you're doing in your 1 Million Truths is so powerful. And so in the back of my mind, I've been thinking, wouldn't it be great if every single one of us had the opportunity to address the question you're posing to people? Because that provides that snapshot, which is more than a snapshot because it touches people so deeply, but it provides an amazing starting point for a really deep conversation among people. And so that's sort of been in the back of my mind is, what would it be like for every Sangha member, right, to be interviewed and to have that minute, they're very short, I don't know how long they are, as a starting point for exploration, because it is hard to get started. I really appreciate that. And unless you have a really strong framework and a sense of trust, and there are people there are not going to let it go off the rails, because people go to a very sensitive place very quickly. So yeah, I think there's a lot of work to do to just set that foundation so that these conversations can happen. But I thought what a great way to start is for everybody to have their little 1 minute a 1 minute interview with the same question, which could be, the question that Mark posed for us about when racism first affected us or when you first became aware of it. I think would be just a powerful entry point for a conversation like that.
That's fabulous. I would volunteer to lead those interviews and to capture them. As Yoku was speaking, the possibility of using the truths that we've created as catalysts to capture the thoughts of the Sangha. So have them watch one of the videos that we've made and then present them with the question, Sangha members with the question, and capture their video response. We actually have that functionality built into the platform. So if there was 1, 2, or 3 truths we want to invite Sangha members to react to and create a video in response to about their experience and the cost or whatever question we want to pose, we can do that very easily. We can do that right now.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
Yeah, that would be good.
Okay.
Thank you. And Yoku, thank you for your comments. And I see that Cynthia, you have raised your electronic hand, I believe. And
Hi, thank you. I'm sorry I don't have the video turned on, but I forgot about the meeting and I'm fairly disheveled. So if you'll forgive me, I'll just go ahead and talk. It occurred to me, it occurred to me listening that I wonder how, the Sanghas are white. And I wonder how many of us have close African-American friends. Because the Sanghas, in a way, do represent the communities that we come out of. And speaking, now I'm an old lady, and so times may have changed quite a bit. But I can say honestly that in my life, I've only had two very close African-American friends who now live in other parts of the world and we're barely in touch. Now that's not many. I do have some of my family members are Asian. And I had one very good, close Asian friend when I was in graduate school who sadly went back to her homeland afterwards. But am I representative of other people in the Sangha? I mean, I'm not sure that many people in the Sangha have close friends who are African American, and some of the problem begins in our own lives. And I don't know exactly the cure for that. And another thing, which may be an uncomfortable truth, is that a lot of us Buddhists are older. And it seems to me that the younger generation is a bit more comfortable interacting across racial lines. Now, I could be wrong, but it seems to me that that's the case. And so I just want to say that I have a feeling that some of the answers really start in our own personal lives. So thank you.
Cynthia, thank you for that. I would agree. I think it does start, and it sorts us back to our personal lives. And that said, if we use the PPP loan or the CARES Act as something, an object to look at, of course, there were some really poor decisions made about who was going to administer that program and distribute funds, and those kind of fall along traditional patriarchy lines and supremacy lines. But if you peel back, it was the lack of network that prevented so many people of color from accessing funds. And when it pertains to, or as it relates to Sangha, I think it's a fair question or an inquiry to just like, who's in my life and what is my network like? And it may just be that there aren't a lot of people of color in the network. And if that's the case, we can just say, okay, we're going to own that. What do we do to grow the network in an appropriate, healthy way? So that's my initial response and contribution. I'm very curious to see and hear thoughts from other folks. Or not.
Or not. Grant, was that a hand? David, you haven't spoken. Thank you, David.
Mark, since you opened the gate to smallness, my own personal smallness, I'll take a step in. And I do have a simple question, I think. So I'll get that out of the way before I reflect a bit. The simple question is, I didn't hear what you said about the slide that pictured Me Too, Shoah, and 1,000,000 truths. So I'm interested in that slide.
Okay.
I
sorry, please.
Well, that I'm sitting here with a lot of stuff percolating in the soup, as you said. And part of that stew has to do with what's happening Saturday with Zen Peacemakers. I'm sitting with an experience I had about 20 years ago of anti-Semitism on the job. And a deeper layer is my question about how I was trained to others, to other people by my parents who survived the Holocaust.
Mm.
And the reason I think my spot here today, right here and now, is small, is in the context of global migration and refugees and all that is percolating inside of me from looking at the roots of who I am today and where I've come from. And just yesterday in the shower, I saw a thought pattern in my mind where I said to myself, both my parents survived Auschwitz. And I said, I had a thought pattern for more than 72 years that my parents were just in labor camps, which was a lie. The lie was not the labor camps. The lie was the just. At one level, it was unjust. At another level, the camp they ended up in was not only a labor camp, but a concentration camp and a death camp. So that's what I'm sitting with in the context of my work and breaking up my pattern of othering. It's very dynamic and very complex, and I'm very touched by your presentation and how you allowed us to enter into your world with our small worlds coming to face you.
Wow, David. Thank you. Very, very powerful words. I really appreciate you sharing. And, I send my love out to you and your family and what you all have endured. To answer your first question, what's up with the Me Too thing and the Shoah Foundation? Me Too was the first movement that allowed people, or women in this case, to communicate and share their experience at scale. And that was enabled mostly by digital technology. So we're leveraging the power of digital technology to replicate that capability. And then the Shoah Foundation, there's many archives in the world, but Steven Spielberg and the team over there at the Shoah Foundation have done a wonderful job of capturing and documenting the stories of Holocaust survivors and people throughout the entire Jewish population and heritage. I think there's over 120,000 videos at this point that they've collected and created, and they're now preserving and stewarding. And so we saw that as an inspiration too. Could we create something equivalent that would be available for future generations for learning purposes and reminder purposes and transformative purposes? When it comes to othering, may I ask a question? I'm wondering if you're othering, if you have any choice around what follows a moment of othering. Does the othering inform and dictate your actions, or are you able to intervene in that? And the question is really around choice. Do you have any choice around othering at this point?
Well, I think that's another complex question. So my simple answer to you is yes.
Great.
That the mental process was very interesting for me to look at how my mind operates. After George Floyd's murder, it wasn't in a meditation, but it was in a quiet time. I saw my mind say, I think it was after Reverend Al Sharpton at the funeral was get your knee off of my neck, how intense he was saying that.
Mm-hmm.
I replayed that, but what I said to myself was, get your boot off of my neck.
Mm.
So the interplay of my history and how I see reality is affected, boot being like a Nazi boot.
Yeah.
So when I walk now, COVID walk with my mask on, and I see somebody that's out of place in my neighborhood, I live in a very white, upper middle class neighborhood. And when blacks are walking, they stand out. So I notice that. But because of this work that I'm doing on myself, I'll now take a moment, and any judgment that comes forth, I have a practice of adding generosity. Because just like Hamilton, there's more there than what I see in anybody, in you. So that's my yes.
That's great. I personally can't answer any more than that. I mean, it goes back to, and I'll wake up in the morning, fired up and ready to end hunger. Like I have to choose to do that. Like I'm pretty okay with people dying, if I leave myself to it. And so what I hear you saying is that you brought yourself through practice to have enough awareness to choose when othering starts to occur. That's huge. That's huge. That has ripple effects. Think about the suffering that you're not triggering or causing. Pause and grow thoughtful. I mean, to put it in kind of a Buddhist phrase. I mean, from the bottom of my heart and soul, thank you so much to all of you. It's truly humbling. It's an honor and a pleasure to be able to share this journey that I'm on and have this particular conversation. One, because it's so deeply personal to me, but two, because I care so much about, this is where I get emotional. I have a deep love for human beings and for people. And I would not be doing what I'm doing right now. And I wouldn't be able to step into that love and caring that I have for other human beings if it were not for my training. And so I want to acknowledge Sangha, the Buddha, the Dharma, and all of you, the conversations I had years ago with the Gyoku, the Ocean Roshi, the Santa Monica Zen Center, and all the members there, and everybody that I've met along the way. So this would not be happening if it were not for our practice in my life. That I'm sure of. I would not have the platform to stand on, the history of their liturgy, the insight, and the pure, beautiful power of it. So thank you, thank you, thank you. And yes, let's continue this. Let's follow up with the videos and see if we can use them to great effect.
Wonderful, wonderful.
So love to you all. Big hug and embrace.